In the study of any period of literature or of any epoch of history, the final and highest effort is always an attempt to gain a close view of the man in that period or epoch, for behind the creations of literature and the events of history, there is always the individual who is, after all, of prime interest to us. One thinks of a Marcus Aurelius or a Lucian in the times of decadent Rome, or of a François Villon in the medieval ages, and the times seem at once familiar and understandable to us. Names like the age of Johnson are more suggestive to us than a name like the 18th century, for only by recalling how Johnson lived, the inns he frequented, and the friends with whom he held conversations does the period become real to us. Perhaps the life of a lesser literary light or of an ordinary Londoner in Johnson's time would be just as instructive, but an ordinary Londoner could not be very interesting because ordinary people throughout the ages are all alike. Whether ordinary people drink ale or Lipton's tea is entirely a matter of social accident and can make no important difference because they are ordinary men. That Johnson smoked and that he frequented 18th century inns is, however, of great historical importance. Great souls react in a peculiar way to their social environment and make it of importance to us. They have that quality of genius which affects and is affected by the things they touch. They are influenced by the books they read and by the women with whom they come into contact, which make no impress on other lesser men. In them is lived to its full the life of their age or generation. They absorb all there is to absorb and respond with finest and most powerful sensitiveness. Yet, in dealing with a country, the common man cannot be ignored. Ancient Greece was not entirely peopled by Sophocleses, and Elizabethan England was not strewn with Bacons and Shakespeares. To talk of Greece and only think of Sophocles and Pericles and Aspasia is to get a wrong picture of the Athenians. One has to supplement it with an occasional glimpse of the son of Sophocles, who sued his father for incompetency in managing his family affairs, and with characters from Aristophanes, who were not all in love with beauty and occupied in the pursuit of truth, but who were often drunk, gluttonous, quarrelsome, venal, and fickle, even as were common Athenians. Perhaps the fickle Athenians help us to understand the downfall of the Athenian Republic as much as Pericles and Aspasia help us to understand its greatness. Individually they are not, but taken in the aggregate they influence to a very large measure the course of national events. In a past epoch, it may be difficult to reconstruct them, but in a living country the common man is always with us. But who is the common man, and what is he? The Chinaman exists only as a general abstraction in our minds. Apart from the cultural unity which binds the Chinese people as a nation, the southern Chinese differ probably as much from the northerners in temperament, physique, and habits as the Mediterraneans differ from the Nordic peoples in Europe. Happily, within the orbit of the Chinese culture, there has not been a rise of nationalism, but only of provincialism, which after all was what made peace within the empire possible for centuries. The common historical tradition, the written language, which has in a singular way solved the problem of Esperanto in China, and the cultural homogeneity achieved through centuries of slow, peaceful penetration of civilization over comparatively docile aborigines, have achieved for China the basis of the common brotherhood so much desired now in Europe. Even the spoken language presents no difficulty nearly so great as confronts Europe today. The native of Manchuria can, with some difficulty, make himself understood in southwest Yunnan. Linguist. A linguist feat made possible by a slow colonization process and helped greatly by the system of writing, the visible symbol of China's unity. This cultural homogeneity sometimes makes us forget that racial differences of blood, do exist within the country. At close range, the abstract notion of a Chinaman disappears and breaks up into a picture of a variety of races, different in their stature, temperament, and mental makeup. It is only when we try to put a southern commander over northern soldiers that we are abruptly reminded of the existing differences. For on the one hand, we have the northern Chinese, climated with simple thinking and hard living, tall and stalwart, hale, hearty, and humorous, onion eating, and fun loving, children of nature, who are in every way more Mongolic and more conservative than the conglomeration of peoples near Shanghai, and who suggest nothing of their loss of racial vigor. They are the Hunan boxers, the Shantung bandits, and the imperial brigands who have furnished China with all the native imperial dynasties, the raw material from which the characters of Chinese novels of wars and adventure are drawn. Down the southeast coast, south of the Yangtze, one meets a different type, inured to ease and culture and sophistication, mentally developed but physically retrograde, loving their poetry and their comforts. Sleek, undergrown men and slim, neurasthenic women, fed on bird's nest soup and lotus seeds, shrewd in business, gifted in belles lettres, and cowardly in war, ready to roll on the ground and cry for mama before the lifted fist descends, offsprings of the cultured Chinese families who crossed the Yangtze with their books and paintings during the end of the Qin dynasty, when China was overrun by barbaric invaders. South in the Chuangtung, one meets again a different people, where racial vigor is again in evidence, where people eat like men and work like men, enterprising, carefree, spendthrift, pugnacious, adventurous, progressive, and quick-tempered, where beneath the Chinese culture a snake-eating Aborigines tradition persists, revealing a strong mixture of the blood of the ancient Yue inhabitants of southern China. North and south of Hankou, in the middle of China, the loud swearing and intrigue-loving Hupei people exist, who are compared by the people of other provinces to 9-headed birds in heaven, because they never say die, and who think pepper not hot enough to eat until they have fried it in oil, while the Hunan people, noted for their soldiery and their dogged persistence, offer a pleasanter variety of these descendants of the ancient Chu warriors. Movements of trade and the imperial rule of sending scholars to official posts outside their native provinces have brought about some mixture of the peoples and have smoothed out these provincial differences, but as a whole they continue to exist. For the significant fact remains that the northerner is essentially a conqueror and the southerner is essentially a trader, and that of all the imperial brigands who have founded Chinese dynasties, none have come from south of the Yangtze. The tradition developed that no rice-eating southerners could mount the dragon throne, and only noodle-eating northerners could. In fact, with the exception of the founders of the Tang and Zhou dynasties, who emerged from northeast Kansu and were therefore Turkish suspect, all the founders of the great dynasties have come from a rather restricted mountainous area, somewhere around the Longhai Railway, which includes eastern Hunan, southern Hebei, western Shantung, and northern Anhui. It should not be difficult to determine the mileage of the radius within which imperial babies were born, with a point on the Longhai Railway as the center of the area. The founder of the Han Dynasty came from Peishan in modern Huzhou. That of the Qin Dynasty came from Hunan. That of the Song Dynasty came from Choshan in southern Hebei, and Chu Hongwu of the Ming Dynasty came from Fengyang and Anhui. To this day, with the exception of Chiang Kai-shek of Zhejiang, whose family history has not been made public, the generals for the most part come from Hebei, Shantung, Anhui, and Hunan, also with the Longhai Railway as the central point. Shantung is responsible for Wu Pei Fu, Chang Sun Chang, Sun Fang, and Lu Yongxiang. I can't read this kind of opinion. Wu Pei gives us Zhi Shui Yun, Li Qinglin, Zhang Shijiang, and Lu Chonglin. Hunan, probably Hunan, produced Yuan Shikai, and Anhui produced Feng Yuxiang and Tuan Shijue. Jiangsu has produced no great generals, but has given us some very fine hotel boys. Over half a century ago, Hunan, in the middle of China, produced Zheng Guofan, the exception that proves the rule. For although Zheng was a first-class scholar in general, being born south of the Yangtze and consequently a rice eater instead of a noodle eater, he was destined to end up by being a high-minded official and not by founding a new dynasty for China. For this latter task, one needed the rawness and ruggedness of the north, a touch of genuine, lovable vagabondage, the gift of loving war and turmoil for its own sake, and a contempt for fair play. Learning and Confucian ethics until one is sitting secure on the dragon throne, when Confucian monarchism can be of extreme usefulness. The raw, rugged north and the soft, pliable south. One can see these differences in their language, music, and poetry. Observe the contrast between the Shenxi songs on the one hand, sung to the metallic rhythm of hard wooden tablets and keyed to a high pitch like the Swiss mountain songs, suggestive of the howling winds on mountain tops and broad pastures and desert sand dunes, and on the other, the indolent Su Chao crooning, something that's between a sigh and a snore, throaty, nasal, and highly suggestive of a worn-out patient of asthma whose sighs and groans have by force of habit become swaying and rhythmic. In language, one sees the difference between the sonorous, clear-cut rhythm of Pekingese Mandarin that pleases by its alternate light and shade, and the soft and sweet babbling of Suzhou women with round lip vowels and circumflex tones, where force of emphasis is not expressed by a greater explosion, but by long drawn out and finely nuanced syllables at the end of sentences. The story is recounted of a northern colonel who, on reviewing a Suzhou company, could not make the soldiers move by his explosive forward march. The captain, who had stayed a long time in Suzhou and who understood the situation, asked permission to give the command in his own way. The permission was granted. Instead of the usual clear-cut Kaipuzhou, he gave a genuine, persuasive Suzhou Kabuzur Ya, and lo and behold, the Zhangzhou company moved. In poetry, this difference is strikingly illustrated in the poems of the North and the South during the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries, when northern China was for the first time submerged under a Tartar rule, and the cultured Chinese migrated southward, for it was a time when sentimental love lyrics flourished in the southern courts, and the southern rulers were many of them great lyric poets, while the peculiar form of love ditties, the Zuyeko, developed among the people. The contrast between this sentimental poetry and the fresh, naive poetry of the North would be highly instructive. So sang the anonymous poet of the South in the popular ditties. Kill the ever-crowing cock, shoot the early announcer of the dawn, that there might be an uninterrupted rolling darkness till next year's morn. Or again, the roads are muddy and forsaken, despite the cold that came to thee. Go and look at the footprints in snow, if thou wilt not believe me. During the Southern Song Dynasty, we saw a peculiar development of a sentimental lyric in intricate meter, the Tai-yi, which invariably sang of the sad lady in her boudoir and her tearful red candles at night, and sweet-flavored rogue and eyebrow pencils, and silk curtains and beaded window screens and painted rails and departed springs, and pining lovers and emaciated sweethearts. It was natural that a people given to this kind of sentimental poetry should be conquered by a northern people who have but short, naive lines of poetry, taken as it were direct and without embellishment from the dreary northern landscape. Down by the Chele River, beneath the Yin Hills, like an inverted cup, is the sky that covers the wasteland, enormous as the earth, and the sky is a deep blue. The wind blows, the tall grass bends, and the sheep and cattle come into view. It was with this song that a northern general, after suffering a heavy defeat, rallied his soldiers and sent them again to battle. And in contrast to the southern songs of love, we have a general singing about a newly bought broadsword. I have just bought me a 5-foot knife. I swing it with a gleaming cadence. I fondle it 3 times a day. I won't change it for 15 maidens. Another song handed down to us reads, in the distance I descry the Menchen River. The willows and poplars stand in silent grace. I am a Mongol son and don't know Chinese lays. A good rider requires a swift horse, and a swift horse requires a good rider. When it clatters off amidst a cloud of dust, you know then who wins and who's the outsider. Lines like these open up a vista of speculation as to the differences of northern and southern blood that went into the makeup of the Chinese race, and seemed to make it possible to understand how a nation subjected to 2,000 years of kowtowing and indoor living and a civilization without popular sports could avoid the fate of civic racial degeneration that overtook Egypt, Greece, and Rome, and the other ancient civilizations. How has China done it? Degeneration. Degeneration is a highly misleading term, for it can only be relative in meaning. Since the invention of the flush toilet and the vacuum carpet cleaner, the modern man seems to judge a man's moral standards by his cleanliness, and thinks a dog the more highly civilized for having a weekly bath and a winter wrapper around his belly. I have heard sympathetic foreigners talking of Chinese farmers living like beasts, whose first step of salvation would seem to lie in a generous disinfection of their huts and belongings. Yet it is not dirt, but the fear of dirt, which is a sign of man's degeneration, and it is dangerous to judge a man's physical and moral sanity by outside standards. Actually, the European man living in overhead heated apartments and luxurious cars is less fitted to survive than the Chinese farmer living in his lowly and undisinfected hut. Nor is cruelty natural in all children and savages, a sign of degeneration. Rather, the fear of pain and suffering is a sign of it. The dog, which remembers only to bark and not to bite, and is led through the streets as a lady's pet, is only a degenerate wolf. Even physical prowess of the type of Jack Dempsey's can lay no claim to human glory outside the ring, or rather only the power to work and to live a happy life. Not even a more highly developed animal whose body is a more sensitized and complicated organism with greater specialized powers and more refined desires is necessarily a more robust or healthy animal. When life and survival and happiness come into the question, the real question of physical and moral health in man as well as in animals is how well he is able to do his work and enjoy his life, and how fit he is yet to survive. If one takes merely the physical evidences, one can see clear traces of the effects of thousands of years of civilized life. Man in China has adapted himself to a social and cultural environment that demands stamina, resistance, power, and negative strength, and he has lost a great part of mental and physical powers of conquest and adventure which characterized his forebears in the primeval forests. The humor of the Chinese people in inventing gunpowder and finding its best use in making firecrackers for their grandfathers' birthdays is merely symbolical of their inventiveness along merely specific lines. The preference for daintiness over power in art has a physical basis in man's lessened vitality and mellowed instinct. And the preference for reasonableness over aggressiveness in philosophy may be actually traceable to the rounded chin and the amorphous face. So also have the contempt for physical prowess in sports and the general dislike of the strenuous life intimately to do with man's decreased bodily energy, especially in the city-living bourgeois class. This is easily observable in a streetcar crowd or a faculty meeting, where Europeans and Chinese are placed in a row side by side. Unhygienic forms of living and the general overeating on the part of the bourgeois Chinese account in many cases for the drooping shoulders and the listless eye. The constitutional differences between European and Chinese children at school age are unmistakable. On the athletic field, it is invariably found that boys who have a European father or mother distinguish themselves by their greater swiftness, agility, and general exuberance of energy, while they seldom excel in tests of endurance and never in scholastic attainments. The much vaunted bossing of the Hanko nationalist government in 1927 by a man called Borodin is due to the simple fact that the energetic Russian, who is taking merely a second-rate place at home, did 3 times the work of a Chinese official. He could talk the Chinese leaders to sleep until the latter had to give in order to be let alone. Many Europeans in Shanghai wonder why they are dropped by their Chinese friends without realizing the simple reason that the latter are not able to stand the strain of a long and exciting conversation, especially when it is in a foreign language. Many a Sino-European partnership, matrimonial or commercial, has been wrecked on the Europeans' impatience with Chinese stodgy smugness and the Chinaman's impatience with the Europeans' inability to keep still. The way in which American jazz band conductors shake their knees and European passengers pace a steamship deck is, to the Chinese, highly ridiculous. With the exception of Chiang Kai-shek and TsuiFeng, the Chinese leaders do not work like a horse. They simply work like civilized human beings, where life is regarded as not worth the bother of too much human effort. And eventually, if Chiang Kai-shek and TsuiFeng come out on top, it will be just on account of their greater stamina and capacity for drudgery. It was TsuiFeng who, using a Chinese idiom, announced that he was as strong as an ox when he resigned and failed to give diabetes or hardened liver or tired nerves for his political resignation, which all the rest of the Chinese officials unashamedly do. A list of the physical and mental ailments, from wrecked stomachs and overworked kidneys or to shattered nerves and muddled heads, publicly announced by the officials during their political sicknesses, most of which are genuine, would cover all the departments and wards of a modern hospital. With the exception of the late Sun Yat-sen, the Chinese leaders, first-rate scholars all, do not keep up their reading and do not write. A work like Trotsky's autobiography by a Chinese leader is simply unimaginable. Even a manifestly lucrative first-class biography of Sun Yat-sen has not yet been written by a Chinese, almost a decade after the great leader's death, nor are there adequate biographies of Sun Kuo-fan or Li Hongchang or Yuan Shikai. It seems the sipping of tea in the yamen and the interminable talking and eating of melon seeds at home have consumed all our scholars' time. Facts like these explain why gym-like verses, dainty essays, short prefaces to friends' works, funeral sketches of friends' lives, and brief descriptions of travels comprise the works of 95% of the famous Chinese authors. When one cannot be powerful, one must choose to be dainty. And when one cannot be aggressive, one has to make a virtue of reasonableness. Only once in a while do we meet a Sima Qian or a Cheng Xiao or a Ku Ren Wu, whose prodigious labors suggest to us the indefatigable body energy of a Balzac or a Victor Hugo. That is what 2,000 years of kowtowing could do to a nation. Study of the hair and skin of the people also seems to indicate what must be considered results of millenniums of civilized indoor living. The general lack or extreme paucity of beard on man's face is one instance of such effect, a fact which makes it possible for most Chinese men not to know the use of a personal razor. Hair on men's chest is unknown, and a mustache on a woman's face, not so rare in Europe, is out of the question in China. On good authority from medical doctors and from references and writing, one knows that a perfectly bare mons varius is not uncommon in Chinese women, The pores of the skin are finer than those of the Europeans, with the result that Chinese ladies on the whole have more delicate complexions than do European ladies, and their muscles are considerably more flabby, an ideal consciously cultivated through the institution of foot binding, which has other sex appeals. The Chinese are evidently aware of this effect, for in Xinfeng, Guangdong, keepers of poultry yards keep their chickens shut up for life in a dark coop without room for movement, giving us the Xinfeng chicken, noted for its extreme tenderness. Glandular secretions from the skin must have correspondingly decreased, for the Chinese explain the foreigners' habit of taking their imagined daily baths by their comparatively stronger bodily odor. Perhaps the most marked difference is in the loss of the full, rich, resonant quality in the Chinese voice, compared with that of the Europeans. While facts regarding the senses are not, to my knowledge, available, there is no reason to suppose a deterioration in the fine use of the ears and the eyes. The refined olfactory sense is reflected in the Chinese cuisine and in the fact that in Peking one speaks of kissing a baby as smelling a baby, which is what is done actually. The Chinese literary language has also many equivalents of the French odeur de femme, like fresh odor and fragrance from marble, a woman's body. On the other hand, sensitiveness to cold and heat and pain and general noise seems to be much more blunt in the Chinese than in the white man. One is well trained for such hardiness in the Chinese family communal living. Perhaps the one thing that compels admiration from Westerners is our nerves. While the sensitiveness is often very refined along specialized lines, the obvious proof of this is the great beauty of Chinese handicraft products in general. There seems to be a corresponding coarseness as regards response to pain and general suffering. The Chinese capacity for endurance and suffering is enormous. But the Chinese people as a race did not survive merely on the strength of coarse nerves or of capacity for suffering. Actually, they survived on the senilization of Mongolian peoples. A kind of phylogenetic monkey gland grafting took place, for one observes a new bloom of culture after each introduction of new blood. The brief sketch of the general constitution and physical condition of the Chinese people shows not that they have entirely escaped the effects of long civilized living, but that they have developed traits which render them helpless at the hands of a fresher and more warlike race. Life with the Chinese seems to move on a slower, quieter level, a level of sedate living, not the level of action and adventure, with corresponding mental and moral habits of a peaceful and negative character. This makes it easily understandable why periodic conquests from the north were inevitable. Politically, the nation has perished several times at the hands of these conquerors. The problem is then how, in the midst of this political subjugation, the nation remained as a nation, not how the nation warded off these military disasters. As Christendom stopped the advance of the Muslims at the Battle of Tours, but how it survived these disasters, in fact, profited from them by the infusion of new blood, without losing its racial individuality or cultural continuity. The national life, it seems, was organized on such a pattern that the loss of the pristine vigor did not mean the loss of racial stamina and power for resistance. Key to this racial stamina and power for resistance is the key to China's survival. The infusion of new blood must remain to a large extent the racial vigor that the Chinese people possess today. Historically, this occurs with such striking regularity at the interval of every 800 years as to lead one to suppose that actually a periodic regeneration of the race was necessary, and that it was the internal degeneration of the moral fiber of the people that brought about these periodic upheavals, rather than vice versa. Dr. J.S. Lee, in a striking paper on the periodic recurrence of internecine wars in China, has made a statistical study of these occurrences, which reveal an exact parallelism in these cycles of peace and disorder which far exceeds the limit of probability, and is perhaps too exact to be expected from the proceedings of human affairs. For the striking fact is that Chinese history can be conveniently divided into cycles of 800 years. Each cycle begins with a short-lived and militarily strong dynasty, which unified China after centuries of internal strife. Then follow 400 or 500 years of peace, with one change of dynasty succeeded by successive waves of wars, resulting soon in the removal of the capital from the north to the south. Then came succession and rivalry between north and south with increasing intensity, followed by subjugation under a foreign rule which ended the cycle. History then repeats itself, and with the unification of China again under Chinese rule, there is a new bloom of culture. Parallelism of events within each cycle unfolded itself with an unreasonable mechanical exactness as to time and sequence. Dr. Lee mentions, for instance, the undertaking of a great engineering feat which was repeated with fatal regularity and at the exact stage in each cycle, namely, immediately at the beginning of a new bloom of culture. For the first cycle, the building of the Great Wall under the Qin dynasty and the colossal palaces, the Ofangkong, which were soon subjected to a conflagration lasting 3 months. For the second cycle, the building of the Grand Canal under the Sui Emperor, who had also magnificent palaces noted for their grandeur and luxury. And for the third cycle, the rebuilding of the Great Wall, in which form it has survived to the present day, the opening up of several new canals and dams, and the building of the city of Peking under the Emperor Yongle of the Ming Dynasty, who was also famous for his great Yongle Library. These cycles comprise from the Qin Dynasty to the end of the Six Dynasties and the Tartar invasion, 221 BC through AD 588, covering about 830 years from the Sui Dynasty to the Mongol invasion, covering about 780 years in the modern cycle from the Ming Dynasty to the present time, a cycle which is yet uncompleted but which has so far unfolded itself in the last 600 years with amazing fidelity to the previous pattern. The peace of 500 years which was granted us under the Ming and Manchu dynasties seems to have run its due course, and with the Taiping Rebellion in the 1850s, which marked the big wave of internecine wars, we are on the crescendo of disorder and of internecine strife, which so far has lived up to its tradition in the removal of the capital from Peking to Nanking in 1927. It is almost prophetic to note that the division between North and South and the subjugation of northern China by a foreign race for the outstanding 200 years have not yet come. These diagrams are reproduced here partly for their intrinsic interest and partly because they are the best short summary of China's political history of over 2,000 years within the scope of a printed page. The curves represent the frequency of wars in China proper. Dr. Lee also mentions the fact that the same parallelism may be observed in the Zhou period, preceding the first cycle in the diagram. The Zhou dynasty, which represented the first bloom of Chinese culture, lasted officially 900 years. Beginning in the year 1112 BC, after the first 450 years of comparative peace and expansion inside China, the capital was moved east owing to pressure from the northwest in 770 BC, from which day on we see increasing wars and strifes among the kingdoms, with the central government steadily losing its control over the feudal lords, giving us the Zhangzhou period of Confucius Annals 722 to 481 BC, and the later Changkuo period or the period of the warring kingdoms 402 to 221 BC, with Zhou constantly extending its territory to virtually the whole southern part of then civilized China. The cycle was then closed with the conquest and reunification of the whole of China by a tribe with a strong mixture of barbarian blood and foreign customs, led by the great Qin Emperor. Facts like these call for an explanation: ethnological, economic, or climatic. Overpopulation, which in its nature can be regularly reached in 400 or 500 years of peace, seems to be an important factor. Peace and culture in any country in the world for over 500 years is unknown to history, and there is no reason why China should be an exception. Yet the review of China's literary history seems to offer another obvious explanation. There was a decadence of moral fiber reflected in poetry and literature during these periods of northern and southern succession and rivalry, as already seen in the poems quoted above in this chapter. The period of northern invasion in the first cycle, the so-called Six Dynasties from eastern Qin to the unification of China under Sui, during which North China was overrun with barbaric conquerors, and period of northern invasion in the second cycle from the southern Song dynasty to the Mongol dynasty inclusive, seem to have corresponded with periods of effeminacy of living and decadence of literary style. First period noted for its artificial and flowery pseudo euphemistic prose, and the second for its effeminate sentimental poetry. One observes, in fact, not a paucity but an overabundance of words played out to their finest nuances, with no more the smell of the soil but the decadent, cultivated, super-refined flavor of court perfume. The Chinese showed a certain fin de sisal delight in the sounds of words, and an extreme refinement in literary and artistic criticism, and in aristocratic habits of living. For it was in these periods that painting and calligraphy flourished, and aristocratic families rose and established themselves to carry on the artistic tradition. Chinese literary criticism first became conscious of itself in the Six Dynasties, and Wang Shi-Chu, the first and greatest calligraphist, who was born of a great aristocratic family, lived in this period. Political weakness and disgrace somehow coincided with artistic refinement, and southern China was ruled in these periods by kings who could not keep their thrones secure but could write exquisite verse. Such ruler poets were Liang Wuti, Nantang Ho Chu, and Chen Ho Chu, all of them kings of extremely short-lived dynasties and writers of tender love lyrics. The Emperor Hui Cheng of the northern Song dynasty was also a noted painter. Yet it was in these periods that the germ for the racial revival was laid, for the northern conquerors remained conquerors only in official power, the substrata remaining Chinese. The great northern Wei dynasty, whose rulers were of the Xianpei race, not only adopted Chinese culture but also freely intermarried with the Chinese. So were the so-called Qin Manchu kingdoms in the Sung dynasty, largely Chinese. The fermenting process was at work. Even culturally, these periods were periods of penetration of foreign influence, notably that of Buddhism, Indian sculpture, the end of the first cycle, and the Mongol drama and music, and and that of the second. The clearest effect of this ethnological mixture is perhaps to be found in the linguistic and physical traits of the modern Northern Chinese, with altered tones and hardened consonants in the language, and a taller stature and a gay rustic humor in the people. It was this amalgamation of foreign blood that accounted for, to a large extent, the race's long survival. Yet, this does not explain all. The question remains how it was possible for the nation to survive these periodic political disasters and not be submerged by them, as old Rome was submerged under the Lombards. Wherein does that racial stamina and capacity for absorbing foreign blood consist? Only by going deeper into these problems can one gain a real understanding of the situation as it stands today. The so-called racial stamina and racial vitality, which, in spite of the retrograde character of the Chinese bourgeois class, enabled the Chinese people to survive political disasters and regenerate itself through foreign blood, is partly constitutional and partly cultural. Along cultural forces making for racial stability must be counted, first of all, the Chinese family system, which was so well defined and organized as to make it possible for a man to forget where his lineage belonged. This form of social immortality, which the Chinese prize above all earthly possessions, has something of the character of a religion, which is enhanced by the ritual of ancestor worship, and the consciousness of it has penetrated deep into the Chinese soul. Such a well-organized and religiously conceived family system was of tremendous force when the Chinese race was thrown into contact with foreign people with less well-defined family consciousness. Barbaric tribes or children of mixed parentage were all too anxious to join the family and claim part of the family immortality, indulging in the luxurious feeling that when one dies, one does not die, but one's self lives on in the great stream of the family life. The family system also acted as a direct incentive to quantitative reproduction, for in order that the lean branch should survive, it is necessary that many lean babies should come into this world. Perhaps it was due entirely to the family system that the Chinese were able to absorb the Jews of Honan, who today are so thoroughly senilized that their Jewish tradition is not eating pork has become a mere memory. The race consciousness of the Jews can be shamed into oblivion only by the greater race consciousness of the family-minded Chinese, and it was no mean accomplishment in the ethnological field. With a less race-conscious and race-proud people than the Jews, like the northern Tartars, for instance, it is easy to see that the Chinese native inhabitants were placed in a great advantage over their foreign invaders. It is in this sense that Manchuria will remain Chinese in spite of all Japanese machinations. The political order may be changed, and rulers may come and rulers may go, but the Chinese families will remain Chinese families. Another cultural force making for social stability was the complete absence of established classes in China, and the opportunity open for all to rise in the social scale through the imperial examination system. While the family system accounted for their survival through fecundity, the imperial examination system affected a qualitative selection and enabled talent to reproduce and propagate itself. This system, which was started in the Tang Dynasty and based on the ultimate Chinese belief that no man is born noble, had its rudiments in the system of civil service and official recommendations in the Han Dynasty, after the Wei and Qin dynasties, 3rd and 4th centuries AD. A change in the control of selection for office brought about a system favoring influential families, so much so that it was stated that there were no poor scholars in the higher classes and no sons of official families in the lower classes. This favored the growth of aristocratic families in the Qin dynasty. With the imperial examination system in the Tang dynasty, 7th and to 9th centuries inclusive, a system was put into effect which, however, it was modified in the following dynasties, maintained down to 1905 an open door for all to rise from poverty to power and fame. While the tests were necessarily somewhat mechanical in nature and were not devised to attract real genius, they were suitable for selecting talent and might be regarded as intelligence tests. Such a system made possible a constant infiltration of talent from the country to the cities, thereby making up for the loss of racial vigor in the upper classes and maintaining a cycle of internal regeneration so much needed for social health. Viewed across the centuries, they must have had a selective effect on the quality of the ruling class that made for social stability. What seems still more important is the fact that the ruling class not only came from the country but also returned to the country, as the rural mode of life was always regarded as the ideal. This rural ideal in art, philosophy, and life, so deeply embedded in the Chinese general consciousness, must account in a large measure for the racial health today. Did the creators of the Chinese pattern of life do more wisely than they knew in maintaining a level between civilization and the primitive habits of living? Was it their sound instinct which guided them to choose the agricultural civilization, to hate mechanical ingenuity and love the simple ways of life, to invent the comforts of life without being enslaved by them, to preach from generation to generation in their poetry, painting, and literature that returned to the farm? For to be close to nature is to have physical and moral health. Man in the country does not degenerate, only man in the cities does. To scholars and well-to-do families in the cities, persistently the call of the good earth comes. Family letters and instructions of well-known scholars abound in such counsel and reveal an important aspect of the Chinese civilization, an aspect which subtly but profoundly accounts for its long survival. I select at random from the extremely precious family letters of Chung Pan Chao to his younger brother, letters that should be counted among the greatest in the world. The house you bought is well enclosed and indeed suitable for residence. Only I feel the courtyard is too small, and when you look at the sky, it is not big enough. With my unfettered nature, I do not like it. Only 100 steps north from this house there is the Parrot Bridge, and another 30 steps from the bridge is the Plum Tower, with vacant spaces all around. When I was drinking in this tower in my young days, I used to look out and see the willow banks and the little wooden bridge with decrepit huts and wild flowers against a background of old city walls, and was quite fascinated by it. If you could get 50,000 cash, you could buy a big lot for me to build my cottage there for my latter days. My intention is to build an earthen wall around it and plant lots of bamboos and flowers and trees. I'm going to have a garden path of paved pebbles leading from the gate to the house door. There will be 2 rooms, one for the parlor, one for the study, where I can keep books, paintings, brushes, ink slabs, wine kettle, and tea service, and where I can discuss poetry and literature with some good friends and the younger generation. Behind this will be the family living rooms, with 3 main rooms, 2 kitchens, and 1 servant's room. Altogether there will be 8 rooms, all covered with grass sheds. and I shall be quite content. Early in the morning before sunrise, I could look east and see the red glow of the morning clouds, and at sunset, the sun will shine from behind the trees. When one stands upon a high place in the courtyard, one can already see the bridge and the clouds and waters in the distance. And when giving a party at night, one can see the lights of the neighbors outside the wall. This will be only 30 steps to your house on the south, and will be separated from the little garden on the east by a small creek, so it is quite ideal. Some may say this is indeed very comfortable, only there may be burglars. They do not know that burglars are also but poor people. I would open the door and invite them to come in and discuss with them what they may share. Whatever there is, they can take away, and if nothing will really suit them, they may even take away the great Wang Shiechi's old carpet to pawn it for 100 cash. Please, my younger brother, bear this in mind, for this is your stupid brother's provision for spending a happy old age. I wonder whether I may have what I so desire. This is typical of the sentiment in Chinese literature. This rural idea of Cheng Panchao's is as much based on his poetic feeling of common brotherhood with the poor peasant, which comes natural to a Taoist soul, as the rural idea of Zhang Kuofan's is based on the desire for the preservation for the family and closely connected with the Confucian family system, for the rural idea of life is part of the social system which makes the family the unit and part of the politico-cultural system which makes the village the unit. It may be amusing to learn that Zhang Kuofan, the great general and first minister of his times, in his family letters to his children and nephews, continually warned them against extravagant habits and advised them to plant vegetables, rear pigs, and manure their own farms. Yet such advice on frugality and industry was expressly given with the aim that the family prosperity might be prolonged. If simplicity can keep a family integrity long, it should do the same for the national integrity. For to Zhang Kuofan it was plain that the official families whose children learn expensive habits of living prosper only for a generation or two. The merchant families who are industrious and frugal may prosper for 3 or 4 generations. The families who till the ground and study books and have simple and careful habits prosper for 5 or 6 generations, while the families who have the virtues of filial piety and friendliness prosper for 8 or 10 generations. It is therefore entirely easy to understand why Zhang regards the keeping of fish, the keeping of pigs, the planting of bamboos, and the planting of vegetables as the 4 things which should not be neglected. On the one hand, we may thus keep up the tradition of our forefathers, and on the other hand, one will feel a sense of life and growth when looking in over our walls, and a sense of prosperity when entering our court. Even if you should have to spend a little more money and hire a few more helpers, the money spent on these 4 things will be well spent. From these 4 things you can see whether the family is prospering or is going down. And somehow from the family instructions of Yan Chitui 531 to 591, Fan Chengyan 989 to 1052, Chushi 1130 to 1200, down to those of Chen Hongmu 1696 to 1771 and Zhang Kuofan 1811 to 1872. This family ideal of industry and frugality and living the simple life persisted and was recognized as the soundest moral heritage of the nation. The family system somehow wove itself into the rural pattern of life and could not be separated from it. Simplicity was a great word among the Greeks, and simplicity, champo, was a great word among the Chinese. It was as if man knew the benefits of civilization and knew also the dangers of it. Man knew the happiness of the joys of life, but also was aware of its ephemeral nature, fearful of the jealousy of the gods, and was willing to take the joys that were simpler but would last longer. For to enjoy too many good things of life was, according to the Chinese, to che fo, or decrease one's lot of happiness in this life. Therefore, one should be just as careful in choosing one's pleasures as in avoiding calamities. Choose the lighter happiness, said a scholar at the end of the Ming dynasties, and somehow there was an echo of consent in the Chinese breast. For human happiness is so precarious that the retreat to nature and simplicity is the best safeguard for it. It must be so, and the Chinese knew it by instinct. They wanted survival for their families, and they achieved it for the nation. It would seem, therefore, that the Chinese as a people avoided the dangers of civic deterioration by a natural distrust of civilization and by keeping close to primitive habits of life. This might suggest that so-called Chinese civilization must be understood in a greatly modified sense. It was a civilization in love with primitivism itself and was not quite ready to say goodbye to it. Certainly, it was not a civilization that had guaranteed the people peace without intermittent periods of bloodshed and disorder, or that had made wars and famines and floods impossible. That a country after 2,000 years of comparatively civilized living could furnish living material for such a story as all men are brothers, when the eating of human flesh, though rare, was still possible, certainly reveals in a measure the mystery of this enigma of social continuity against the havoc of civilization. Sun Quan, Yi Kuei, and the host of robust robbers on the top of Yangshanpo, although coming almost 15 centuries after Confucius, do not suggest to us representations of an outworn civilization, but rather happy children of a people in the twilight of a dawning culture, when security of life was yet unknown. It seems as if the race, instead of reaching full maturity with Confucius, was really enjoying a prolonged childhood. This brings us to the extremely interesting question of the racial constitution of the Chinese race. Whether, as an ethnological entity, it reveals not so much the characteristics of an old people as those of a people in many respects still in its racial youth and far from reaching racial maturity. A distinction may be made by saying that the Chinese are culturally old but racially young, a theory which has found support among some of the modern anthropologists. Griffith Taylor thus classifies the Chinese among the youngest strata in the evolution of the human race according to his migration zone scheme. Havelock Ellis also characterizes the Asiatics as being racially infantile, in the sense of retaining some of the adaptability, flexibility, and pristine all-round Shunpo nature of childhood before reaching specialized development. Perhaps a prolonged childhood is a better term for infantilism, and arrested development or stagnation are misleading terms. Cultural stagnation of the Chinese is only a misconception of one looking at China from the outside, without knowledge of her inner life. One needs only to think of the late development of the Chinese porcelain, which did not come, as many foreigners imagine, from the time of Confucius, but from as late as the 10th century, and was then only slowly developed until it reached its perfection under Kangxi and Qianlong in the 17th century, almost before our eyes. Progress in lacquer, printing, and painting was slow, but each dynasty brought it a step forward. The renowned Chinese style of painting did not come into being until the last 1,000 years of the Chinese national life, a late period for an old civilization. And in literature, one needs only to think of the lateness of the prose epic and tale of wonder for the Shui Hu, all men are brothers, and HsiangJu must be considered such, and they were certainly perfected after the 14th century, almost 2,000 years after Confucius and Lao Tzu had lived and died. The epic was strangely unknown in ancient China, or it was irretrievably lost without any existing trace in literature. The narrative poem came only in the Han Dynasty, and there were not many of them. The drama came into popularity only with the Mongol dynasty in the 11th century. Tales of imagination like the HsiangJu came about at the same time when the Chinese imagination was stimulated by Buddhism. The novel as such really had a humble beginning only in the 9th century, and its mature development late in the 14th and 15th centuries, and reached its climax in the beginning of the Manchu dynasty with the Red Chamber Dream, contemporary and oriental counterpart of Clarissa Harlow. Had China's culture life flowered and then ended a few centuries after Confucius, as the Greek genius did, there would have been only some fine moral maxims and folk lyrics, and certainly none of China's great paintings, novels, and architecture to offer to the world. This sounds as if we are not watching the arrested development of a nation that reached its full bloom in its young golden age like Greece and Rome, but that we are watching the prolonged childhood of a race that took millenniums to reach full development and then is perhaps still courageous enough for further spiritual adventure.